Welcome to the Word for Life podcast, a daily devotional covering the entire Bible from Genesis to Revelation.
In Leviticus chapter 15, we read about bodily discharges that make a person unclean and how they can be cleansed. First, we need to understand that in the Old Testament law, some things were considered holy. For example, priests, the articles in the tabernacle, sacrifices placed on the altar, these were all holy. Then there were clean and unclean things. God Himself designated what is clean and unclean. In chapter 11, God designates certain animals as clean and others as unclean animals. We must understand that clean does not mean holy and unclean does not mean unholy or sinful or cursed. When we read chapter 12, we saw how a mother who had given birth is unclean for 7 days. But this does not mean she is sinful, cursed, or unholy. She can get cleansed and get back to normal life. Unclean persons could not, for example, eat holy food or enter the tabernacle until their uncleanness was cleansed. Leviticus chapter 7, verse 20-21 says, "Anyone who touches something unclean, whether human uncleanness or an unclean animal or any unclean creature that moves along the ground, must not eat of the meat of the fellowship offering." But friends, once they are cleansed, they can enter the tabernacle. Similarly, in chapter 15, God's concern is about discharges from a man or woman's body, specifically those from the sexual organs. Again, we should not conclude based on this that somehow God thought that sex was unholy, sinful, and ugly. Sex is God's gift to humans. When humans use it as God's gift and not misuse it in ungodly ways, God is pleased. Therefore, according to the regulations in chapter 15, a person who has bodily discharges became unclean for a day, that is from evening to next day evening. They are required to do certain cleansing procedures and then they can consider themselves clean. Friends, from chapter 11 till this chapter 15, we have been reading about these purity laws. One may wonder, what is the point of these purity laws? Why did God give these laws? Why should Israel keep herself pure? This chapter provides the purpose of purity regulations. In verse 31, we read, "You must keep the Israelites separate from things that make them unclean, so that they will not die in their uncleanness for defiling my dwelling place which is among them." So, the purity laws is about defiling God's presence, His tabernacle, His dwelling place. You see, in chapter 10, Nadab and Abihu dishonored God's tabernacle and died. So, the purity laws are set forth right after that incident in chapter 11 to 15. So, the main concern is God wants His dwelling place not to be defiled. Through these commandments, God taught Israel about His holy presence and wanted Israel not to take His presence among them lightly. Now, believers in the new covenant rely on Christ who has made them pure. 2 Corinthians 5:21 says, "God made Him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in Him we might become the righteousness of God." Friends, Jesus became unclean so that we can be clean. This part of Leviticus actually teaches us how much we need Christ. For a believer, Christ is the only one who can make him clean. Christ is the only one who can make him worthy of approaching a holy God. You see, the Jewish leaders of Jesus' time only tried their best to erect barriers for unclean people. In Mark 5, we read of a woman suffering from an issue of blood for 12 years. The religious leaders permanently stopped her from even entering society. But by cleansing her, Jesus showed not only that he can make anyone clean, but also showed that barriers are no longer there. Friends, through faith in Jesus, now anyone can be clean and can approach God freely.
Thanks for listening. We'll see you tomorrow for the next episode of the Word for Life podcast.